the sentence that never sleeps. Like, subscribe, and comment if you're brave enough to walk into the quietest place on earth, because once you hear this story, the silence will never sound the same again. The sirens cut through the night like a blade. Rain slicked the highway outside Huntsville, Texas, as patrol cars boxed in a black sedan swerving across 3 lanes, its headlights flashing like panic-stricken eyes. The driver didn't slow down. He accelerated. 90 miles an hour. 100. Dispatch crackled with fragments of fear and urgency. Armed suspect. 2 bodies. Possible third victim unaccounted for. The chase ended the way most of them do, suddenly. A blown tire. A violent spin. The sedan slammed sideways into a concrete barrier, steam rising from the hood like breath leaving a dying animal. Officers approached with weapons drawn, hearts hammering in their throats. Inside the car, Marcus Hale sat frozen, hands trembling on the steering wheel, his face blank, almost calm. 3 hours earlier, no one knew his name. The crime scene was a modest suburban home, the kind that disappears into the background of American life. White siding. A basketball hoop over the garage. But inside, the air was thick with shock. 2 adults lay motionless in the living room. No signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle. It looked less like a burglary and more like an execution interrupted. Detective Laura Keene arrived just before dawn. She'd seen enough death to know when a case was going to rot your sleep away. She noticed the smallest details first. The family photos still standing upright, the untouched coffee mug on the counter, the back door slightly open as if someone had hesitated before leaving. Whoever did this hadn't rushed. That scared her more than blood ever could. Marcus Hale had been a ghost to the system. No violent record. Quiet job at a shipping warehouse. Recently, divorced. The kind of man neighbors describe as kept to himself. But investigators found something else. A sealed court document buried in county records. A civil case dismissed years earlier. Wrongful termination. A settlement offer he'd refused. It wasn't about money. As the interrogation began, Hale barely spoke. He stared at the table, jaw clenched, eyes hollow. When Keene asked him why he ran, he finally looked up. Because once you hear the door close, he said, everything ends. The trial moved fast. Too fast for comfort. Prosecutors painted Hale as a man who snapped under pressure, who let resentment ferment into rage. The jury listened in silence as evidence stacked up. The car, the fingerprints, the timeline. The verdict came back unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The sentence followed. Death. Marcus Hale was transferred to death row within weeks. The wing sat far from the rest of the prison, separated by steel doors and long, echoing corridors. Correctional officers called it the freezer. Not because it was cold, but because nothing moved. No shouting. No fights. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of footsteps that never lingered. Inmates on death row spend 23 hours a day alone. Meals slid through slots. Conversations reduced to whispers through concrete walls. Time stretches there, thick and suffocating. Officers say you can feel it pressing against your chest the moment you step inside. Hale adjusted quickly. Too quickly. He didn't shout. Didn't beg. Didn't appeal in the way others did. Instead, he started writing letters. Dozens of them. To journalists. To legal aid groups. To the families of the victims. Most were never sent. When a corrections officer finally inspected Hale's cell more closely, he noticed something carved faintly into the concrete wall behind the bunk. Words etched so lightly, they were almost invisible. You convicted the wrong man. That alone wasn't unusual. Every death row has men claiming innocence. But tucked beneath the carving was something else. A sequence of numbers. Dates. Times. Coordinates. When Detective Keene received the photograph of that wall, her blood ran cold. Because one set of coordinates pointed to a storage facility less than 10 miles from the original crime scene. And it had never been searched. But when they unlocked the storage unit and rolled up the rusted metal door, what they found inside forced everyone to question whether Marcus Hale was truly the end of the story, or just the beginning. the quiet that knows too much. The storage unit smelled like dust, oil, and something older, something that had been sealed away and forgotten on purpose. Detective Laura Keene stood just inside the rolled-up metal door, her flashlight beam trembling slightly as it cut through the darkness. The unit wasn't large. 10 by 10. Concrete floor. No windows. At first glance, it looked disappointingly ordinary. A folding table. A locked filing cabinet. 3 plastic bins stacked neatly against the back wall. Too neat. Crime scenes, Keene had learned, often spoke louder in what they tried to hide than in what they displayed. She stepped closer, heart pounding, and lifted the lid off the first bin. Inside were files. Dozens of them. Manila folders, each labeled with a name, a date, and a city. Texas. Louisiana. Oklahoma. The dates stretched back nearly 15 years. These aren't financials, an investigator muttered beside her. They're people. Every folder contained the same chilling pattern: photos taken from a distance, handwritten notes detailing daily routines, work schedules, family connections. Surveillance. Long-term. Obsessive. This wasn't rage. This was planning. The second bin held burner phones. All destroyed. All missing SIM cards. The third contained maps, each marked with red circles and arrows that converged on a single point: the house where the 2 victims had been found. The victims Marcus Hale had been convicted of murdering. Keene felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Hale hadn't just known these people. He had been studying them. Or someone had. Back on death row, Marcus Hale sat on a steel bunk, listening to the distant clang of doors closing for the night. Silence returned like a heavy blanket. When the warden approached his cell the next morning, Hale didn't look surprised. "You found it," Hale said softly. The warden stiffened. "You don't know what we found." Hale smiled, just slightly. "I know exactly what you found. And I know what you didn't." Under renewed scrutiny, the case cracked open. Appeals lawyers rushed in. Journalists circled. The story shifted from closed-and-shut murder to something darker and far more complicated. Hale claimed he'd been hired years earlier, not to kill, but to document, to observe, to collect information for a private consulting firm that specialized in risk analysis. The firm, however, no longer existed. Its registration records were scrubbed. Its listed executives were dead or untraceable. And then the first witness disappeared. A former warehouse coworker who testified against Hale failed to show up for follow-up interview. His apartment was found unlocked, his phone still charging on the kitchen counter. No signs of a struggle, just absence. Then a journalist investigating the storage unit files reported her laptop stolen from a locked hotel room. Nothing else taken, only the files. Keene began to realize they weren't reopening a case. They were stepping into an active operation. Death row remained unchanged, quiet, sterile, unmoving, but Hale suddenly became its most dangerous inmate. Not because of what he might do, but because of what he knew. Every request to speak with him was monitored. Every word logged. And still, information leaked. One night, as Keene reviewed old evidence, she noticed something she'd missed before. Security footage from the night of the murders showed a second vehicle parked half a block away. At the time, it had been dismissed as irrelevant. The license plate belonged to a government-owned car. Not local. Federal. When confronted, Hale didn't deny it. They needed a fall guy, he said through the thick glass of the interview room. Someone quiet. Someone forgettable. Someone already trained to watch without being seen. Keene asked the question she'd been dreading. Who are they? Hale leaned forward, his chains clinking softly. The same people who decide who lives comfortably and who dies slowly. That night, the prison went into lockdown. An anonymous call warned of a security breach targeting death row. Officers rushed the unit, boots echoing through the concrete halls. When they reached Marcus Hale's cell, the door was still locked. But the cell was empty, and carved into the wall, beneath the old message, were 3 new words that hadn't been there before. Check the schedule. The last door. Death row lockdowns are supposed to freeze time. Steel doors seal. Count alarms echo. Every movement is logged. So when officers confirmed Marcus Hale hadn't escaped, but had been moved, the truth landed harder than any riot ever could. He hadn't vanished into the night. He'd been transferred on paper, reassigned under emergency authorities signed 12 minutes before the lockdown began. The schedule Hale had warned them about wasn't a calendar. It was a list. Detective Laura Keene stood in a windowless conference room as federal oversight representatives slid a thin folder across the table. Inside were transport orders, clearance codes, and a destination facility that officially did not house death row inmates. An evaluation center. A place where prisoners were kept temporarily when their cases became matters of national sensitivity. Keene's voice stayed steady. You don't relocate a condemned man in the middle of the night unless you're afraid of what he might say. No one answered. The evaluation center sat in the desert, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by fencing that didn't show up on public maps. Inside, Hale was held in a single cell, stripped even barer than death row. No letters. No visitors. No clock. Just light that never fully dimmed. When Keene finally saw him again, weeks had passed. Hale looked thinner, older. But his eyes were sharp. They're cleaning up, he said quietly. Loose ends don't get appeals. Keene had pieced together enough to understand the shape of it. The consulting firm Hale mentioned hadn't been fictional. It had been a subcontractor, one that operated in the gray space between corporate security and government intelligence. Their job wasn't killing. It was identifying vulnerabilities. People whose lives intersected with lawsuits, whistleblower cases, or liability risks. Sometimes those people died. The couple murdered in the suburban house hadn't been random. One of them had been preparing to testify in a class action case that would have exposed years of falsified safety reports. The night they were killed, Hale had been there, but not as the executioner. He'd been the witness they never intended to leave alive. The real shooter had never been charged. His name never entered evidence. He was protected by the same signatures that had quietly moved Hale out of death row. Keene filed motions. She pushed for hearings. She leaked what she could without burning herself. The response was swift and surgical. Her access was revoked. Her phone tapped. A warning delivered politely over coffee. Some truths destabilize more than they save, she was told. Marcus Hale's conviction was vacated 3 months later, not overturned, not reversed, but nullified on procedural grounds. No press conference. No apology. He was reclassified, his sentence commuted to life without parole, then transferred again. This time to a different prison. Not death row. Just another maximum security unit where men shout, fight, and disappear into noise. The quiet that had defined his existence was gone. And that, Keene realized, was the point. Years passed. The class action lawsuit quietly collapsed after key evidence was ruled inadmissible. Witnesses recanted. Records were lost. The consulting firm was never mentioned again. Keene left law enforcement. But she never stopped watching. One winter morning, she received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letter. Just a photocopy of a prison transport log. A new name. A new inmate. Recently placed on death row in another state. The intake notes were brief. Minimal communication. No disciplinary issues. Writes constantly. Carves messages into walls. At the bottom of the page, someone had handwritten a familiar sequence of numbers. Dates. Times. Coordinates. Keene understood then what death row really was. Not just a place of punishment, but a storage room for truths no one wanted spoken out loud. A place so quiet that secrets could die there unnoticed. As she folded the paper, one thought refused to leave her mind. They thought the most dangerous part of death row was the execution. But the real threat was the silence before it. And if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's waiting behind the next locked door.